Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we're exploring the theology of love in Saint Augustine and how it forever changed Western understandings and Western culture as it relates to our philosophy of love. God is love, the first epistle of John declares. This, of course, is a hallmark of Christian theology. God is truth, God is love, God is reason. But God is love has always had the pride of place among the Christian understanding of divinity. But in expositing on the homilies of the first epistle of John, St. Augustine would go even further than the statement God is love. Augustine plays a syllogism that would forever alter Christian theology, as well as the philosophy, theology, and culture of the West. God is love, that much is true, but Augustine also goes on to state that love is God. Delectio Deus est, he tells his parishioners. Augustine's luminous writings on love stretch over decades and came from a multitude of contexts and various theological disputes during his life. In the Confessions and De Trinitate and his many private letters, he commends love as a form of psychological introspection, an investigation into the human heart. Turn to your heart and look to your heart are two of his most common phrases used in these introspections of love. He implores himself, his readers, his parishioners to turn inward into themselves and to find what really moves their heart to love. Our own phrases today of turning to your heart, look to your heart, feel what is inside of you are all derivatives of Augustine's theology of love. In his other writings, like The City of God, Augustine is writing to comfort the beleaguered and the refugee migrant, while he is also critiquing the critics of Christianity and being engaged in a deconstruction of social power and power systems in human relations, showing how various relationships of power are the antithesis of love and embody the lust to dominate others. In his many homilies, he is also drawing out the working of God in humans, in Christians in particular, so that we can understand the nature of what it means to live a charitable, loving life. Love alone is what distinguishes the children of God from the children of the devil, Augustine famously wrote in his fifth homily on 1 John. Here, Augustine was trying to tease out a problem in the broader disputes among the Donatists. He writes this homily during the Donatist controversy. How can we know who Christians are when everyone is confessing the same Christ? The Donatists confess Christ and the sacraments. Catholic Christians, a phrase pioneered into prominence by Augustine during the Donatist controversy, also confess Christ and the sacraments. Therefore, how do we really know who the Christians are when everyone is confessing Christ and the sacraments? Augustine maintained what Jesus himself taught to his disciples. To love God is to love your neighbor. For Augustine, perfect love entailed this: a willingness to sacrifice for others, a willingness to give to others, and a willingness to be brought into relationships with others. In deconstructing the Donatists, and it must be remembered that Augustine is really the first systematic deconstructionist in the entire Western tradition of philosophy, Augustine sees a pattern between the unwitting pawns of the demons and those who are the disciples of Christ. The disciples of Christ are always willing to sacrifice for others, give to others, and most importantly, come into a relationship with others. The unwitting pawns of the demons, in this case the Donatists, are the exact opposite. They are isolationist. They only look to themselves, and they cut themselves off from everybody else. Hatred of others, and especially hatred of neighbors, is the embodiment of the life of Cain. And the life of Cain, of course, led to the slaughtering of his brother. And of course, it's important to remind people here that during these disputes, the Donatists famously attempted to assassinate Augustine many times, and they successfully assassinated other Catholic Christians in North Africa who were their opponents. And they always refused to enter into new relationships with others. What Augustine is saying here is that one should always look to the actions of individuals to see if they really are Christian, rather than what they say out of their mouth. Love speaks louder through actions rather than words. Famously, Augustine defines sin as a misdirected form of love. To love something apart from God is sinful, as it ruptures the subject or the object from its relationship to and with God, who is again love, truth, and wisdom. More specifically, in his homilies on 1 John, Augustine says that sin is acting contrary to the commandment of love. Those who are more concerned with their own lives, their own goods, who refuse to serve others and maintain an exclusivism that prevents communion and relationships with others, are acting contrary to the law of love, and therefore are in a state of sin. This, of course, is explicitly the case with the Donatists and other schismatic and heretical communities, though Augustine also warns to his own parishioners that this may be the case with them at their own individual and personal levels. Apart from being the doctor of grace, Augustine is generally regarded as the foremost philosopher and theologian of love. Love, Augustine maintained, in contrast to the Greek philosophers, is what defined humanity and the human condition. Yes, it is true, as Augustine says, that humans possess a rational soul, an intellect that is able to know truth and reason, for truth and reason are God. But moreover, more than that, humans are animals of love, and it is always the heart of love and not the rational soul that governs man. Thus, as Augustine argues, it is truly love that moves the human condition rather than rationality or the intellect. And this is why Augustine is the first voluntarist, the first philosopher of the will, the first philosopher of love in antiquity, in the sense that he identified the passions as the defining characteristic of humans. Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, etc., all identified humanity as the rational man. And more than that, passion was generally belittled or something to be entirely overcome, purged, and negated. Passion was so bad, for the Stoics, for instance, that passion was the great danger of all life. Augustine here vehemently disagrees. The preoccupation of the heart, the will, is love, and that, of course, is the great revelation of Christ, according to Augustine. For his commandment is not to know God and to know your neighbor, but to love God and to love your neighbor. The teachings of Jesus in the gospel and the writings of the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul, according to Augustine, reveal the shortcomings of a purely intellectual and rational approach to theology and philosophy. This was the error of the Platonists, the Aristotelians, and the Stoics. They shunned the human heart. They shunned the reality of love and privileged rationality and the intellect at the expense of passion. Passion, Augustine is arguing throughout his homilies and throughout his theology, is what really moves all souls to God, and frankly, it is what moves all humans in every action that they do. Everyone engages in activity because of a love for that activity, or the belief, proper or improper, that by engaging in this activity, they will gain some form of love out of it. To love properly, ordo amoris, is to be of God, since God is love, and love is God. To love improperly is sin, or in the mature theology of Augustine, one might better understand improper love as a lustful form of idolatry. Lustful idolatry is entirely self-centered, whereas love is centered on others. Lustful idolatry seeks the praise of the world and the satiation of only the self in encounters and experiences. It is a form of psychological destruction in the relationship that we have with others, the cosmos, and ultimately to God. It is entirely directed to oneself and therefore, as mentioned, cuts oneself off from the entire rest of the creation, of the whole of existence. Proper love, by contrast, is all-encompassing. It is all about relationships. Thus, it is a form of love God and love your neighbor. For love requires relationships. It takes everything that God has given us in existence and recognizes God in love through the love of others and the love of the world. Augustine stresses on this point that there is nothing wrong with loving what God has created, assuming we recognize God in all things. To love another is to love God when you properly understand that God is present in another human being. By loving another human being, Augustine argues, you are loving God. By loving creation, not as God in of itself, but as containing the traces of God, you are also loving God. As Augustine says, love your brother, for you love the brother whom you see. You will see God at the same time, because you will see love itself, and God dwells within it. Likewise, Augustine also goes on to say in another homily, by loving love, you love God. The idea that love speaks louder than words is Augustinian in its origin. It is Augustine who said in his 6th homily on 1 John, we too now look at deeds, not speech. Love, our actions, reveal who we are, and we become what we love. Moreover, from Augustine, he constantly warns his congregation to beware of those Christians who call themselves Christians, but who have no deeds to support their public professions. To love is to be like God. Incarnational love, a love embodied in relationships with others, is Augustine's great theological vision. As he writes, do you love God? What shall I say? That you will be God? I don't dare say this on my own. Let us listen to the scriptures. I have said that you are gods, and that all of you are sons of the Most High. Why wouldn't you love what God made? God doesn't forbid you to love those things, but you mustn't love them in the expectation of blessedness. Rather, you must favor and praise them in such a way that you love the Creator. Love of others that recognizes God in all things is the only love that is worthy of being called God, because God is love. If a person loves his brother, Augustine says, the Spirit of God abides in him. By loving love, one loves God. The Western notion that love itself is divine, enduring, and everlasting, that love speaks louder than words, that in order to understand your own love, you must feel the love within your heart, all of that is bequeathed from Augustine. For in his 7th homily on 1 John, Augustine inverts the idea of God as love to say that love is itself God, and therefore all proper love is a manifestation and expression of divinity. Delectio Deus est.